A thriving orchard, its branches heavy with crimson apples, yet no villager dares to taste them. The Whitfield family once lived here, proud farmers who vanished without a trace. Whispers spoke of cries under the trees, of roots that drank more than rainwater, until a drought revealed the truth bones tangled in roots, children's graves hidden beneath the soil. If you enjoy these haunting tales of history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story, and uncover the haunting fate of the Whitfields. The year was 1871, and America was still healing from the wounds of a brutal civil war. In towns scattered across the countryside, the scars of conflict lingered like ghosts. Men returned broken from battle, farms lay in ruin, and families struggled to begin again in a world that felt both familiar and strange. Hunger was a frequent visitor, and whispers of superstition carried just as much weight as sermons from the pulpit. It was a time when land meant survival. To own soil was to secure a future. Yet some plots were avoided, left untended no matter how fertile they looked. Farmers spoke in hushed voices about bad ground, places where blood had spilled, where battles had raged, or where the earth seemed unwilling to yield without demanding something in return. Even in the most devout Christian communities, people still believed certain lands carried curses. The orchard where the Whitfields would stake their claim was one of those places. It lay just outside a quiet settlement, a stretch of land with soil dark as ash and strangely damp, even in dry summers. Locals said cattle would not graze there. Children dared to play near its edges, returned pale and shaken, muttering of sounds beneath the soil like shallow breathing. The land had history, though not the kind anyone proudly recorded. Old men remembered it as the site of a bloody skirmish during the war, where bodies had been buried in shallow pits under the cover of night. Others swore that long before white settlers came, indigenous tribes had marked it as a place of warning, a ground that consumed life but gave nothing back. Whether these tales were truth or superstition, no one could say, but everyone agreed the land was touched by something unclean. Still, desperation often silences caution. The Whitfields were new to the county, a family searching for a fresh start after the war had stripped them of everything. To Elias Whitfield, the patriarch, the land was opportunity. Where others saw death, he saw fertile soil ready to grow profit. He dismissed the warnings of neighbors as fear-mongering, the silly chatter of men too weak to seize fortune when it stood before them. When Elias purchased the land, he did so at a fraction of its worth. The deed was signed quickly. The former owner seemed almost eager to be rid of it. Within days, Elias and his family began to clear brush and prepare the soil for planting. His vision was ambitious, an orchard that would rival any in the region, a monument to Whitfield determination. From the beginning, townsfolk whispered about the strangeness of what grew there. The trees Elias planted seemed to take root unnaturally fast, their branches stretching tall within seasons, not years. Leaves appeared dark, glossy, almost wet to the touch. And when fruit began to hang heavy from the branches, it was unlike any the townspeople had seen. Apples, swollen, deep red, their skins glistening as though polished by unseen hands. To many, this bounty was unsettling. Fruit was not meant to come so soon, not meant to shine with such unnatural luster. Superstitious neighbors began calling them blood fruit. Some claimed that when one was sliced open, the flesh inside was stained pink, like watered wine. Others said the smell lingered too long on the hands, sharp and metallic, like iron. Elias Whitfield, of course, ignored these tales. To him, the orchard was proof of his own vision and hard work. He boasted that the soil was rich with the ashes of history, and that the orchard would be his family's legacy. He welcomed no criticism, no warnings. For Elias, the land was conquered, and the past buried beneath it had no power over him, yet not everyone shared his pride. His wife, Margaret, grew uneasy with each passing season. She claimed the ground beneath their home never seemed still, as though shifting slightly at night. She told neighbors of dreams filled with whispering voices, dreams in which the trees bent low to speak in words she could not understand. But her confessions were brushed aside, dismissed, as the nervous complaints of a woman too fragile for farm life. And so the Whitfields remained, their orchard growing strong, their farm becoming known as both a wonder and a warning. Outsiders admired the harvest, but locals refused to buy the fruit. A strange tension settled around the farm, admiration for the Whitfields' prosperity, and dread of what it might have cost them. The land seemed to have accepted them, at least for a time. But as history has taught again and again, what the ground accepts, it may also one day reclaim. Every tragedy begins with ordinary people, and the Whitfields were no different. On the surface, they looked like any other hard-working farm family, ambitious, private, and determined to survive the harsh world left behind by war. Yet behind their farmhouse walls, shadows stretched longer than daylight could reach. Elias Whitfield, the patriarch, was a man hardened by both conflict and loss. Before the war, he had been a modest craftsman, carving wood and repairing wagons. But years on the battlefield changed him. He returned with a stiff leg from an old wound, a deep scar along his jaw, and a gaze that seemed forever restless, as though watching for enemies that no longer marched in uniform. People described him as stern, proud, and quick to temper. Elias had one vision: to restore the family name with wealth and land. He spoke of the orchard as if it were destiny, as if God himself had chosen him to coax life from cursed soil. When neighbors cautioned him about the land's reputation, he sneered and told them only cowards feared ghosts. To Elias, fear was weakness, and weakness had no place in his household. Margaret Whitfield, by contrast, was soft-spoken and frail, though not without a quiet strength. Raised in a devout home, she carried her Bible everywhere, whispering psalms when the nights grew long. Yet there was an unease about her that neighbors could not ignore. Some said she looked as if she had one foot in this world and the other somewhere else. She was prone to long silences, sitting on the porch and staring into the orchard with an expression both fearful and entranced. Margaret often confided to the town's pastor that she heard voices when the wind passed through the trees. At first she dismissed them as imagination, but over time she became convinced the orchard was speaking directly to her. She told him that the soil beneath their feet felt restless, as if the ground itself remembered. The pastor advised more prayer, more faith. But Margaret once admitted, in a trembling whisper, that she feared the prayers were not being heard. The Whitfields had 3 children, each bearing their own mark of innocence, soon to be lost. The eldest, Thomas, was 15. He had inherited his father's strong frame, but also his stubbornness. Thomas disliked the orchard and often spoke of leaving home to find work in the city. He had no patience for whispers of curses, but he distrusted the land in his own way, avoiding the trees at night, refusing to eat the apples his father praised. To him, the orchard felt like a prison, and the more it prospered, the more he longed to escape. The middle child, Clara, was 12. Sensitive and quiet, she seemed drawn to the orchard more than anyone else. Neighbors remembered seeing her wandering between the rows of trees, humming softly, touching the bark as though the trees were her companions. Clara claimed she could feel their heartbeats if she pressed her ear against their trunks. When her mother scolded her for this strange behavior, Clara simply replied that the trees were kind to her in ways people were not. The youngest, Samuel, was only 7. Frail and often ill, he clung to his mother's skirts and rarely ventured far. Samuel was said to be frightened of the orchard, telling his siblings that he dreamed of hands reaching up from the soil to pull him under. His fevers grew worse with each season, and though Margaret prayed fiercely for his healing, Elias dismissed the boy's fears as childish weakness. Still, Samuel's wide eyes and trembling voice left a lasting impression on those who recalled him. Together, the Whitfields lived as a family bound by ambition, faith, and fear. They rarely welcomed visitors, preferring to keep to themselves. Their isolation only deepened the suspicions of the townsfolk. Some whispered that Elias worked his family too hard, that the children's pale faces were proof of cruel discipline. Others suggested Margaret's strange behavior was a sign of madness slowly consuming her. Yet no one could deny the orchard flourished, its branches heavy with fruit, unlike anything else in the region. That fruit, however, became the subject of rumor. Townsfolk noticed how the apples from the Whitfield orchard seemed too vibrant, too perfect. Those who dared taste them claimed the sweetness lingered too long, coating the tongue with a metallic aftertaste. Stories spread of apples that bled when bitten, though no one could say if it was truth or imagination. Markets refused to buy them, neighbors turned away from them, and soon the Whitfields were left with bounty they alone consumed. The image of the family grew darker. Elias was often seen late at night, lantern in hand, tending to the trees when all others slept. Margaret grew pale and thin, her eyes hollow, her prayers whispered frantically in the dead of night. Clara seemed ever more connected to the orchard, while Thomas grew restless, openly challenging his father's decisions. Samuel, weak and trembling, rarely left his mother's side. In hindsight, many said the Whitfields were marked from the beginning, drawn into a pact they did not fully understand. To outsiders, they were simply another farm family, clinging to survival in hard times. But to those who lived nearby, the Whitfields were a warning. Prosperity born too quickly, on land too cheap, could never be trusted. And as the orchard thrived, stretching higher and bearing heavier fruit, the family within the farmhouse began to wither. By the third year of the Whitfields' orchard, the whispers had grown louder than the Sunday hymns. People no longer spoke openly about their unease, but the orchard's presence hung over the town like a cloud too heavy to break. It began with small things a reasonable man could dismiss, yet together they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. The birds, for one, refused to nest among the trees. Even in spring, when songbirds filled every hedgerow and chimney, the Whitfield orchard remained silent. Branches bloomed heavy with fruit, yet not a single nest rested in their shade. Neighbors said they had watched birds approach, circle warily, then scatter as though driven off by some invisible hand. Elias, of course, scoffed, claiming cats or hawks kept the birds away. But Margaret whispered to a friend in town, "What kind of tree bears no birdsong?" Then came the animals. Stray dogs, wandering too close, would stop short and growl, fur standing on end, before bolting in the opposite direction. Horses pulling wagons near the farm stamped and snorted nervously, refusing to pass until forced. Hunters claimed no deer ventured into the orchard's boundary. Even insects seemed fewer beneath its canopy. At night, strange lights were seen among the trees. Passing travelers spoke of lanterns flickering where no man worked. Some swore they heard voices, children's cries, carried on the wind, or low murmurs that echoed like prayers. One boy, dared by his friends to cross the orchard after dark, stumbled back pale as bone, muttering that something had whispered his name from beneath the soil. He never again went near the farm. The farmhands Elias hired did not stay long. They left muttering about unease they could not explain, tools misplaced, the sensation of being watched, shadows that shifted when no one stood near. One young man swore he saw Elias digging at midnight, burying something small in the orchard rows. When pressed, he claimed it was the size of a bundle, too small to be logs. Within days, the boy left the county altogether. Margaret herself seemed most haunted. She confided to the town pastor that she often woke with dirt under her fingernails, though she had never left her bed. Once, in tears, she admitted she found her nightdress soiled with mud she could not explain. She told him of dreams in which she walked barefoot among the trees, guided by voices that spoke in tones both soothing and terrifying. The pastor urged her to pray harder, to resist temptation, but Margaret whispered in reply, "What if it isn't temptation, but command?" Her health declined. Neighbors saw her walking slower, her frame thinner, her eyes dark and hollow. Elias, meanwhile, seemed unaffected, almost emboldened by his orchard's bounty. He dismissed Margaret's complaints as weakness, declaring that God blessed their farm while others starved. But in town, people murmured that Elias's orchard was not blessed. It was bartered. Children sang cruel rhymes about blood-fruit trees, claiming those who ate the apples would see faces in their dreams. Some parents forbade their children from even passing the farm's fence. Yet Clara, the Whitfields' daughter, seemed to grow only closer to the orchard. Townsfolk often spotted her wandering between the rows, humming to herself, her small hands tracing the trunks like old friends. When asked about it, she only smiled and said, "They like when I sing." Tensions grew. One autumn, when a farmhand went missing, whispers turned to accusations. Some said he had run off with debt. Others claimed he had disappeared into the orchard, swallowed like the birds and deer. No evidence was ever found, but the orchard was always the first suspect. By then, even the sheriff avoided the Whitfield farm, unless duty forced him there. He admitted to neighbors that the land made him uneasy, though he refused to say why. When pressed, he muttered something about the air being too still, like waiting for something to happen. The orchard had become more than just a farm. It was an omen in plain sight, a place people crossed themselves when passing, a place whispered about in the safety of kitchens, but never confronted directly. Fear grew roots deeper than any tree could plant, and suspicion wrapped around the Whitfields like vines too tight to cut. In hindsight, the signs were there, the silence of birds, the restless soil, the cries on the wind. But fear kept neighbors at a distance, and pride kept Elias from listening. The Whitfields stood alone in their orchard, their fate sealed not by one act, but by countless small omens that no one dared face until it was far too late. The winter of 1871 came early, sweeping across the valley with a bitterness that gnawed through wood and stone alike. Snow fell heavy, burying fences, darkening chimneys, and sealing families inside their homes for weeks at a time. For the Whitfields, whose farm already carried whispers of unease, the winter became their final curtain. Neighbors recalled that the last time anyone saw the family was just before Christmas. Elias had been in town, his coat dusted with frost, bargaining for salt and flour. He spoke little, his face set in its usual grim line. Margaret was not with him. She had not been seen for weeks. Some noted that Elias's eldest son, Thomas, trailed behind him that day, his eyes downcast, his hands trembling as though the cold cut deeper than it should. Clara and little Samuel remained at the farm. After that, silence. As the storm tightened its grip, smoke from the Whitfield chimney ceased to rise. In other homes, families huddled by fires, their hearths glowing like beacons against the snow. But from the Whitfields' farm, no glow came. No tracks marked the path to their door, no voices carried across the frozen fields. The orchard, strangely, stood untouched by snowdrifts. The branches seemed to hold their own against the storm, apples clinging to their stems long after every other farm's harvest had spoiled. Weeks passed. The storm relented. Townsfolk emerged, checking on neighbors, tallying losses. But when they turned their eyes to the Whitfields' land, dread set in. The house looked too still. Doors shut, windows unlit, no figures moving among the trees. Concern gave way to fear. No one volunteered to visit until the sheriff, urged by duty, saddled his horse and rode out. What he found deepened the mystery. The farmhouse stood silent, snow piled high against its sides. The front door was ajar, creaking gently in the wind. Inside, the air was heavy with rot. Plates of food sat on the table, blackened with mold, as if the family had been called away mid-supper. Chairs were pushed back, one toppled over, yet there were no signs of struggle. Margaret's Bible lay open on the floor, its pages stained and damp. Upstairs, the children's beds were empty, the quilts tucked neatly as though awaiting their return. The sheriff searched for tracks, but the snow revealed nothing. No footprints led away from the house. No wagon had departed, no horse had carried them off. The Whitfields had simply vanished. What made the scene more unsettling was the orchard. Against all reason, the trees bloomed in the dead of winter. Their branches hung low with apples, vibrant and red against the white snow. The fruit seemed to pulse with color, glistening in the weak sunlight. The sheriff, unnerved, plucked one and cut it open. He later swore to friends that the flesh inside was streaked with pink veins, and the juice that dripped from it stained the snow like diluted blood. When word spread, the town erupted with speculation. Some insisted the family had fled, perhaps debts drove them away, or shame. Others whispered of violence, that Elias had finally snapped and dragged his kin into the woods to die. But there were those who believed neither tale. They looked at the orchard, heavy with out-of-season fruit, and muttered that the land had claimed its payment at last. A group of men returned days later to investigate further, but their search brought no answers. The barn stood stocked with feed, untouched. Elias's tools remained neatly arranged. Clothing hung in wardrobes, boots lined by the door. Everything suggested the family had intended to return at any moment. Yet no voices called from the fields. No laughter echoed across the snow. Superstition grew bolder. Women told their children that the Whitfields had been taken beneath the trees, their bodies feeding the roots that bore the uncanny harvest. Men crossed themselves when passing the farm. Even the bravest refused to enter the orchard after dark. The sheriff, torn between duty and dread, filed his report with words that convinced no one. The Whitfield family is missing. Circumstances unknown. His handwriting trembled across the page, betraying more than he intended. In the weeks that followed, the farmhouse stood as a monument to unease. The orchard's fruit continued to hang, untouched, as if daring someone to claim it. But no one did. The apples withered on the branches, blackened by time, yet not a bird or animal disturbed them. The Whitfields had disappeared into silence, and the land itself seemed to hold the secret. To this day, townsfolk claim the snow never quite settles over the orchard as it does elsewhere, as though the ground beneath resists being covered, as though it remembers. Years slipped by after the Whitfields vanished. The farmhouse decayed, its timbers sagging, its roof splitting beneath the weight of storms. The orchard, however, stood stubbornly alive. Each spring, blossoms flared white and pink, and each autumn, apples ripened heavy on the branches. Yet no one dared to eat them. The land was avoided, spoken of in whispers. Children dared one another to touch the fence, but even the bravest never stayed long. The mystery lingered unsolved until a cruel summer drought brought the orchard back into focus. The year was 1893, more than 2 decades after the Whitfields had disappeared. A sun baked the soil until it split open in jagged seams. Crops failed across the county, rivers shrank to trickles, and the orchard, for the first time in memory, seemed to suffer. Leaves curled, apples shriveled, and the earth between the rows cracked wide. One afternoon, a group of boys wandered into the Forbidden's orchard, drawn by the dare of exploring what their parents forbade. They laughed and pushed one another, pretending to be fearless, until one tripped on a jagged rise of earth. When he brushed the dirt aside, he froze. A small, pale object jutted from the ground-rounded, hollow, unmistakable. It was a skull, no bigger than his hand. The boys screamed and fled, their terror carrying them straight into town. The sheriff, skeptical yet compelled, followed their trembling directions back to the orchard. Kneeling in the hot dust, he brushed aside more soil and confirmed the truth. The drought had revealed what the earth had long concealed. Word spread like fire. Men gathered with shovels. Women stood at the fence clutching their children, and the sheriff ordered a search. The orchard was no longer silent. The sound of digging filled the air, punctuated by cries when the dirt gave up another fragment of bone. What they found went beyond a single child's remains. Shallow graves littered the orchard rows, each one holding a piece of the horror. Small skeletons, their fragile rib cages collapsed inward. Skulls with teeth barely grown. Mothers' bones lying twisted as though in anguish. The remains of Margaret Whitfield were identified by a tarnished locket still hanging from her neck. Yet the sight that struck deepest terror was the way the bones were entangled with the roots. Some skeletons appeared fused to the trees themselves. Roots curled through rib cages like invasive fingers. Branches had grown around skulls, locking them in wooden prisons. The orchard had not merely concealed the dead, it had consumed them. The townsfolk recoiled in horror. Some swore the roots pulsed as they were cut away, as though the orchard itself resisted surrendering what it had taken. Others claimed a smell rose from the soil, not just of decay, but of iron and something sweet like apples rotting in the heat. The sheriff's men kept digging, uncovering more than just the Whitfields. Among the remains were bones that did not belong to the family at all. At least 3 skeletons were identified as townsfolk who had gone missing years earlier. A farmhand who vanished in 1869, a young woman lost on her way home, and a drifter last seen seeking work at the Whitfield farm. Their presence raised even darker questions. Where was Elias Whitfield? His body was never found. The patriarch, who had planted the orchard with such determination, was conspicuously absent from the graves. Some believed he had murdered his family and escaped, leaving their bodies to feed the trees. Others whispered that he too had been swallowed, his remains deeper still, beyond the reach of shovels. The discovery split the community. Some demanded the orchard be burned to ash, its trees cut down, its soil salted. Others argued it should remain untouched, a graveyard for those lost. Ultimately, fear won out. Few dared swing an axe against the trees. Men who tried claimed the trunks bled sap as dark as rust, and that the air grew too heavy to breathe when the first strikes fell. They left their axes in the ground and swore never to return. The graves were marked hastily, but no true burial was given. The remains were too tangled with roots to separate fully, too broken to lay properly in coffins. Families mourned, but quietly, almost in shame, as though speaking of the orchard might draw its curse closer. In the weeks that followed, the town changed. People crossed themselves when passing the land. Children were warned never to play within sight of the trees. Travelers heard the tale and carried it far, until the name Whitfield Orchard became synonymous with horror. Some claimed that at night, when the wind passed through the branches, the trees groaned like grieving mothers. Others swore they saw figures moving between the rose children, pale and hollow-eyed, vanishing when approached. The orchard, once Elias's dream of prosperity, became a place no one dared touch. What truth lay in the soil remained uncertain. Murder, madness, or something older than both, no one could say for certain. But the orchard had spoken, and it spoke in bones. The orchard's secrets had been unearthed, but its story was far from finished. In some ways, the discovery only deepened the mystery. Bones lay tangled with roots. Children's remains fused to the very trees that once bore fruit. The town could not look away, yet no one could agree on what had truly happened to the Whitfields. And so began the arguments, The whispered theories, each darker than the last dot. The first and most practical explanation came from those who saw Elias Whitfield as the villain. They believed he had gone mad, broken by the war, by poverty, by the weight of ambition. In their minds, Elias slaughtered his family in a fit of rage or despair, burying their bodies hastily in the orchard before fleeing into the night. His missing body, they said, was proof he still walked somewhere, a fugitive hiding his sins. Some swore they had heard of a scarred man limping through other counties, using a false name. Others claimed he boarded a train west and was never seen again. To them, Elias was no ghost, but a murderer who had escaped justice. But not all believed that. Story.another theory cast suspicion on Margaret Whitfield. Those who remembered her pale frame and haunted eyes whispered that she had gone mad, not her husband. They spoke of her sleepless nights, her whispered confessions to the pastor, her dreams of walking barefoot among the trees. Some suggested Margaret, driven by voices she believed divine or perhaps demonic, had sacrificed her children beneath the orchard. They pictured her digging shallow graves in the moonlight, praying with dirt-caked hands, offering her family to something she could neither fight nor understand. Her body, found among the dead, gave weight to the theory. Perhaps she had taken her own life after the killings, a final act of despair. Yet the most unsettling theory was not about Elias or Margaret at all. It was about the land itself. There were those who swore the orchard had grown too quickly, too perfectly, to be natural. They claimed the roots were hungry, that they reached for what lay nearest, pulling flesh into soil, drinking marrow like water. The Whitfields, they argued, had not murdered anyone. They had been consumed. The orchard fed on them, one by one, until nothing remained but bones entwined with wood. The fruit's unnatural sweetness, the bird's refusal to nest, the cries heard at night, these were not signs of human crime, but of a curse older than the Whitfields, older even than the war. The pastor tried to calm the town, preaching that sin had invited judgment. He declared the Whitfields were punished for pride, for ignoring warnings, for planting orchards on ground already tainted by blood. His sermons painted the tragedy as divine retribution, but his words only fed the fire. Some parishioners nodded in grim agreement, while others whispered that even God could not explain what they had seen in those shallow graves. Fear changed the town. Men who once scoffed at superstition now crossed themselves when passing the orchard. Women told their children never to speak the Whitfields' names aloud. At night, windows were shuttered tight, lamps extinguished early, as though silence might protect them from whatever lingered in the soil. And yet, for all the terror, there were those who could not resist their curiosity. A few farmers, bold or foolish, attempted to claim the land in the years that followed. They dreamed of harvesting its rich soil, of profiting where the Whitfields had failed. None lasted long. One man swore he heard whispers under his floorboards each night, voices calling his children's names. Another family claimed their livestock sickened and died within weeks of moving in. A third farmer, who tried to chop down the orchard, fled in panic after the first swing of his axe released sap that smelled of iron and smoke. All left quickly, abandoning their claims, warning others never to return. The orchard itself seemed to wither after the graves were disturbed. The once vibrant apples shrank, branches twisted, blossoms thinned. Some said the trees mourned their lost feast. Others believed the orchard had simply finished its purpose, satisfied with the blood it had consumed. Still, the land remained untouched. No farmer dared plow it. No settler dared build upon it dot in time. The theories became folklore, each retelling shaped by fear and imagination. To some, Elias remained a madman at large. To others, Margaret was a mother undone by madness. And to many, the orchard itself was alive, a hungry mouth that had once been fed too well. What all agreed upon was this: the Whitfields were gone, their fate bound forever to the cursed orchard. And the town, no matter how far the years carried it forward, would never be free of the shadows cast by those trees. The orchard never recovered from what the earth revealed. Once its branches had dripped with impossible fruit apples, too large, too red, too sweet. But after the graves were disturbed, the harvest faltered. Blossoms came late, fruit rotted on the stem, and by the turn of the century, the orchard stood as little more than a skeleton of itself, its twisted branches clawing upward like blackened fingers. Still, no one dared to cut it down. The land remained empty, abandoned by farmers who refused to touch soil that had once given back bones. Children were warned never to cross its fence. On autumn nights, parents whispered to restless little ones, "Stay away from the Whitfield orchard, or the trees will take you too." For generations, the farm existed more in story than in sight a scar on the land, too deep for grass to cover. Travelers passing through heard the tale and carried it elsewhere. Soon the Whitfield orchard was spoken of in distant towns, a place of horror where a family vanished and the earth revealed their resting place decades later. The details twisted in retelling. Some said the orchard still bore fruit, its apples glowing faintly in the moonlight, luring the curious to taste. Others swore that those who dared bite into one saw faces in their dreams, pale children with hollow eyes, whispering to be set free. Even in the modern age, when superstition was supposed to fade, the land resisted its redemption. Developers who considered purchasing it abandoned their plans after strange mishaps. Equipment broke down inexplicably. Surveyors claimed their compasses spun uselessly near the orchard. One construction crew, braver than most, reported that the ground groaned when their machines pressed too deep, as if something beneath still shifted in protest. Locals, of course, never needed convincing. To them, the orchard was simply cursed, and always would be. Even today, farmers drive their cattle in wide circles to avoid it. Hunters refuse to camp within sight of its gnarled trees. And on certain nights, when the wind moves just right, neighbors swear the orchard still breathes, a sound like shallow sighs moving through the leaves, a chorus of the lost. What truly happened to the Whitfields remains unsolved. Was it the madness of a father? The despair of a mother? Or was it the hunger of the land itself, reaching for the lives placed upon it? Historians can argue, but the soil keeps its secrets. Only the orchard knows the truth, and it is not speaking. What we are left with is a legacy, a reminder of how beauty can mask decay, how prosperity can grow from suffering, and how some places never let go of their dead. The Whitfields may be gone, their names fading from records, but their story lingers in the whispers, in the way even now people lower their voices when passing the farm's edge. And so, when you next see a field of trees blooming too brightly, too perfectly, remember the Whitfields. Remember the orchard that fed on more than rainwater. And ask yourself, if the ground beneath your feet could speak, what truths would it reveal? If you believe history hides more horrors than it tells, join us again. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories of forgotten tragedies and haunted places time tried to bury. And in the comments below, tell us, do you think the Whitfields were victims of murder, madness, or the orchard's hunger?